Hey everybody, how's it going? I'm Paul, I'm with the Dicey Review, and tonight we're going to be learning how to play the 1 to 5 player game First Rat, being released by Pegasus Spiel. Now, rats for generations have talked about the great cheese treasure known as the moon, and after discovering a comic book illustrating the moon landing, the rat children have decided that they have everything they need in the junkyard to build a rocket and get there. Can you be the rat family that donates the most and helps contribute to this cause? Well, let's get to the table and see how it's played. First Rat comes with all of the components that you see here, including a Start Rat marker, player components in the 5 different player colors, neutral components for when playing with less than 5 players, 60 cheese markers in values of 1 and 3, 12 moldy cheese markers, 16 award tokens, 10 backpacks, 10 bottle caps, 6 energy drinks, 4 super rats, 10 comic tokens, and 95 total building materials. The game also comes with a double-sided game board, components for a variable layout including junkyard path tiles and different score tracks, 22 cards for the solo game, and a score pad. To begin setup, place the game board in the middle of the table. Make sure to place it on the side that doesn't have the letters in the circles. Then place a supply of the building materials, the awards, the cheese, and the moldy cheese next to the game board. Then each player will choose a team color, take all of the rats, the 10 score marker cubes, the rat burrow marker, and the light string marker, and take one of the player aids in their player color. The player aids are double-sided, and on the reverse side will show the phases of a turn. Players will place 2 of their rats in the start space of the junkyard path, and then 2 of their rats in the nursery in the middle of the rat's burrow. They'll place their rat burrow markers on the start space of the rat burrow path, and their light string marker on the start space of the light string. Next, shuffle the 10 bottle cap markers, and then place 6 of them face up in the Madcap Crow booth section of the board right here. Then, based on the player count, you'll want to place a number of energy drink tokens in Zippy the Frog's booth on the board. Then mix all the backpacks face down, and turn over a number of backpacks face up in Harry the Hamster's booth section on the board, based on the player count. Then you'll populate this library section of the rat burrow with comic tiles. For the first game, it's recommended that you remove the 4 comic tiles showing the 4 super rats and just place these 6. For future games, you can mix all comics face down and just turn 6 face up from the shuffled stack. In games with fewer than 5 players, you'll also want to place some of the neutral markers on the different score tracks around the board. In 1 to 4 player games, any space with this symbol on it would be covered, and in 1 or 2 player games, any space with this symbol would be covered as well. After this has been done, you'll determine a first player. The player who most recently ate some cheese would begin the game, or alternatively, you could just determine this randomly. The first player would get the first rat marker and 1 cheese. Then the next 2 players in clockwise order would get 2 cheese, and if there were a 4th and 5th player, those players would get 3 cheese. After this has been done, you're ready to play. First Rat is a point-to-point movement racing set collection game of sorts, and players will be playing over a set number of rounds until the end of the game is triggered. And on a turn, a player will be able to move 1 or more of their rats along the path to stop at different spaces to collect different bonuses, building materials, or cheese. Players can use the building materials that they collect to build different rocket parts that will generate them in-game points. They can turn in collected cheese to help feed the crew, which will also generate in-game points. And they can potentially send rats as ratronauts, which will garner them in-game points as well. As they make their way along the path, they can also make a stop at different vendor booths to gain different useful items that will either give them bonuses during gameplay or in-game scoring opportunities. If they stop on light bulbs, they'll be able to move their light bulb marker along the track, which can potentially give them increased resources on their turn. And if they land on spaces showing apple cores, this will allow them to move along the rat burrow track, giving them access to comics or the ability to unlock more workers or generate in-game points as well. On a player's turn, they'll carry out the following steps in order. The first step is moving their rats. When a player moves their rats, they can either choose to move one of their rats up to 5 spaces, or they can move as many of their rats as they want up to 3 spaces. If a player decides to move multiple rats on a turn, all of their rats have to end their movement in a space that's the same color. So for instance, if the blue player wanted to move both of their rats, they could move the first rat 2 spaces, as this is up to 3, and then they could move their second rat 2 spaces, and this wouldn't break the rule as they've both ended on a yellow space. A player can never end their movement in a space containing another one of their own figures, but a player can end their movement in a space with other players' rat figures. If a player ends their movement in a space with other players' rat figures, they have to pay that player 1 cheese. If a player were to end their movement with multiple players' rat figures, they would have to pay each player 1 cheese. And it is possible that a player may have to pay the same player more than 1 cheese if they land in more than one space with that player's rat, like this situation for instance. If a player doesn't have enough cheese to pay other players, they have to take a moldy cheese marker, which will give them 3 cheese that they can pay with. A player has to take enough moldy cheese markers to be able to pay all players that they owe, but they can't ever take more than they need voluntarily. Players can't get rid of the moldy cheese markers, and they're worth -2 victory points at the end of the game for each marker. Players can also utilize shortcut spaces if they want to while moving, but to utilize those spaces they have to pay the indicated resource to cross that tunnel. If a player reaches the last space of the board, that space can be considered any color for the purposes of collecting resources, which we'll talk about now. Most of the resource spaces are fairly straightforward. For instance, if a player lands on this space, they would gain 1 of this type of resource from the supply. If they land on this space, they would gain 1 of this resource, the vinegar bottle. And if players were to land on these cheese spaces, they would gain a cheese for every cheese symbol on that space. As players get farther and farther along the track, the rewards that they receive will increase. For instance, here they would gain 2 cheese. Later down the track, players will also have a chance to get different types of resources, for instance, this calculator here. If a player lands on a light bulb space, they would be able to move their light bulb marker 1 space for each light bulb symbol showing on the space. Light bulbs provide 2 potential benefits. First, they would increase the production value of spaces equal to or before the light bulb marker on the track. So for instance, if the green player were to land on this space with the light bulb marker here, they would gain 2 of this resource when landing on that space instead of the 1 pictured. And if later on in the game their light bulb marker were to exceed this space, they would gain 3 light bulbs as a reward instead of the 2 listed. If a player's light bulb marker lands on or passes these light bulb spaces right here that show the construction bulbs, they would be able to immediately put one of their scoring cubes on the highest available marker on the light bulb track. If they were to place here, it would be worth 9 points at the end of the game. And it's important to note that there's no limit on how many light bulb markers can be on a particular space. So later on, if the blue player were to advance to this space, they would simply stack their marker on top of the green. If a player lands on one of the apple core spaces, they get to move their rat marker 1 space in the burrow for each apple core present. So for instance, if a player landed on this space, they would get to move their marker 2 spaces. If the light bulb were on or past this space, they would get to move their marker 3 spaces. The rat burrow marker will always advance clockwise around the track. When players reach this section or this section, they have a choice if they want to go up along the track. If a player were to stop on or past this space on the burrow track, they would immediately get to select one of the comics to place in front of them. These comics will give you some type of an ability or special power that this player can use for the rest of the game. We'll go over the details of each of these special abilities later in the video. If a player were to stop on or pass this space, they would get to unlock 1 more of their rats. And if the player were to stop or pass this space of the track, they would immediately get to put their cube on the highest available scoring space on that track. After players have moved their rats and gained any rewards or collected any resources from the spaces where they end, if they've ended their movement on one of these 3 spaces, they have an optional 3rd step on their turn of going shopping. The 3 merchants are Harry the Hamster, Zippy the Frog, or the Madcap Crow. And for each of these spaces, players have either the option of paying the indicated number of cheese to get one of the items listed, or stealing one of the items without having to pay any of the cheese listed on that space. And it's important to note that if multiples of your rat move to different vendors, you can shop with each of those rats. If you choose to spend the indicated amount of cheese, you would simply return this number of cheese to the supply, take one of the items, and then your rat would stay there. If, however, you decide to steal one of the items instead of paying its listed cost, you would take one of the indicated items, and then the rat that ended their turn on this space would have to move back to the starting space of the junkyard track. These backpacks are items that you can buy from Harry the Hamster. These backpacks would simply increase the action type that's indicated on the backpack. For instance, if a player were to select this backpack, every time they land on a light bulb space, they would get 2 additional light bulb movement in addition to whatever the spaces would give them where they've landed. It's important to note that these bonuses would add 2+ to the total movement, not 2+ for each space where they land. And the same applies for the backpacks that give bonuses to resources. For instance, every time a player lands on a green space with this backpack, they would gain +1 to their total resources collected on that turn, not +1 per space. If a player lands at Zippy the Frog's booth, they could buy one of these energy drinks. Energy drinks would allow a player to double their reward on a particular turn. So for instance, during the collect resources step of a future turn, if a player were set to get 7 cheese because they've gotten 5 from the spaces and 2 from their backpack, they could spend an energy drink to double that total. It's important to note that if a player were to spend an energy drink, they should simply turn it face down but keep it face up in front of them, because there are some bottle caps that give points for energy drinks at the end of the game. If a player ends their movement at the Madcap Crow's space, they have the option to buy bottle caps. Bottle caps will give players additional victory points for certain goals that they might have achieved during the game. We'll go over the details of what each bottle cap scores for later in the video. After players have moved, collected resources, and then potentially gone shopping at one of the vendor spaces, they will also always have an optional step 4 to build rocket parts or donate cheese. Building rocket parts would allow a player to place one of their scoring cubes on these tracks. To build a rocket part, players would have to turn in the indicated resources from their personal supply to the general supply. So for instance, a player could turn in 5 of these resources and 2 of these resources to build one of the rocket thrusters and place a cube on this spot. Players will always place cubes on the leftmost available spot, showing the highest victory points they can. If a player is able to place one of their cubes on each of these 3 tracks, they would immediately get to place an additional cube on this track for completing all 3 of the rocket-type parts. It's also important to note that there's no limit to how many cubes can be placed on a track. If all of the previous spaces on a track fill up, any number of cubes can be placed on this last space of the track. Donating cheese works in exactly the same way as building rocket parts. But instead of turning in resources, players would turn in 10 cheese to be able to place one of their cubes on this track. This track holds players' rats instead of their scoring cubes. To be able to place a rat on this track, players would have to end their movement on this last space of the junkyard track. As we've stated earlier, this space can count as any color. And when a player ends their movement on this space, they would be able to send this rat to the highest available space on the Ratronaut track. They would additionally get a bonus of taking one of these award tokens, which would give them 3 victory points at the end of the game, or immediately getting another rat from the nursery on the burrow for free. It's important to note that players can only select one of these award tokens as a bonus if they have at least 1 rat somewhere else on the junkyard path. After players have moved 1 or more of their rats, collected resources, and then optionally gone shopping, and optionally built or donated cheese, it would then be the next player's turn in clockwise order. If a player has ever placed their 4th rat on the launch pad space, the game would end at the end of the current round, making sure that each player had an equal number of turns. If a player has ever placed their 8th cube on one of the scoring spaces, the current round would be finished and then 1 full additional round would be played, and then the game would end. Players would score points for any cubes that they have on any of the scoring tracks, for any of their rats that they have on this track. They would score additional points for any bottle caps that they've collected, and they would gain or lose points based on their award tokens and any moldy cheese tokens they may have. And finally, for every 4 resources that a player has, including cheese, calculators, tins, boxes, or vinegar, they would get 1 victory point. The player who has the highest total would win, and if there's a tie, the player who has the most Ratronauts on this space track would win. And if there's still a tie after that, the victory would be shared. If you get tired of playing the standard game, the reverse side of the board also includes spaces where you can mix up the components and have a variable setup to change how the game plays each round. More details about that can be found in the back of the rulebook. I want to take a moment to briefly look at all of the different bottle cap tokens and how they'll score you victory points at the end of the game. Each of these bottle cap tokens would score you additional victory points at the end of the game for each scoring cube that you have on the appropriate track. So for instance, for each cube that a player has on the light bulb track, they would score an additional 4 victory points. If a player collects this bottle cap, it would give them an additional 4 victory points for every rat that they have on the Ratronaut track. This bottle cap would simply give you 12 victory points, and for every cube that you have on the thruster, cargo hold, and cockpit score tracks, you would lose 2 victory points. But it's important to note that you can never lose victory points with this bottle cap. And then finally, this bottle cap at the end of the game would give you 2 points for each backpack, energy drink, whether it's used or not, comic, and bottle cap, including this particular bottle cap. Next, I want to briefly look at the comic tokens and the bonuses that they'll give players. If a player collects this comic, they would be able to move each rat an additional space if they move multiple rats. So instead of up to 3 spaces, they could move multiple rats up to 4 spaces. It's important to note that a single rat movement is still capped at 5. If they collect this comic, they can turn in 1 fewer resource whenever building any of the rocket parts. If they gain one of these 2, they would be able to use the appropriate colored shortcut for free without having to turn in the resource depicted above the shortcut. If players were to collect this comic, they wouldn't have to pay other players cheese when landing on a space that contains their rats. And if they collected this comic, they wouldn't have to end on the same colored space if ending their movement on a green or an orange space. So for instance, they would be able to end their movement in both green and orange spaces if moving multiple rats per turn. It's important to note that this only works with green and orange spaces. It wouldn't allow players to end in a yellow space and a blue space, for example. These 4 comics, when collected, give you the ability to turn one of your rats on the board into a super rat. To indicate this, the players, when collecting the appropriate comic, would take the matching figure and place it on one of their rat figures to let everyone know that this rat has a special power. Lola Rat would allow that particular rat to move an additional 2 spaces. If you're moving only the rat that has this power-up, you could move up to 7 spaces. And if you were to move her with a group of other rats, you could move Lola Rat up to 5 spaces, and the other rats 1 to 3 as normal. It's important to note that this particular power does combo with the other comic that allows you to move multiple groups of rats 1 space further. The Rat Woman power-up would allow you to steal an item from a vendor without having to go back to the start space. Once again, just with this particular rat that has the power-up. Neil Ratstrong can move as far as you want if you only advance that powered-up rat. You can even move this rat directly to the launch pad space. And if Neil Ratstrong is on the scoring space at the end of the game, you'll gain double the amount of listed victory points for that particular powered-up rat. It is important to note that Neil Ratstrong is not allowed to steal items from the vendors. And finally, Arnold Ratnager would be able to collect an extra resource from whatever spot he lands on. So for instance, 1 additional movement on the light bulb track, 1 additional cheese, etc. Alright everybody, that was our video. Thanks so much for watching. We hope that it was helpful and we hope that it was informative. If you have any questions about how to play the game still, please comment below or email me directly at thedicey@gmail.com. Make sure and connect with us on social media, and you can also visit our Board Game Geek Guild. Also, if you enjoy the content and find value in what I do, please make sure to hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, and click the bell so that you're notified whenever I have new videos that come out. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, I'll see you at the table.